My name is Rachel. I'm 32 years old, and I work remotely as a graphic designer for a marketing company in Boston. At the beginning of January, after a very intense period of work and having people around me all the time, I decided to rent an isolated cabin in Vermont for a few days so I could focus on a big project and also have some silence. I found the cabin on a vacation rental website. It was in a more remote area surrounded by forest, with the nearest town about a 25-minute drive away. When I arrived, it was already lightly snowing, that kind of fine snow that slowly accumulates, covering everything in white. The cabin was simple, made of wood, with a small living room, an integrated kitchen, and a bedroom upstairs. The heating was electric, and there was also a fireplace which I used more for the feeling of comfort than out of necessity. On the first day, everything was exactly as I expected. Silence, no car noise, just the sound of the wind passing through the trees and, occasionally, a branch cracking in the distance. I spent the day working on my laptop, made a simple meal at night, and went to bed early because the internet signal was better in the morning, and I wanted to take advantage of it. The next morning, I woke up around 7 a.m. with the room very bright because of the snow reflecting the light outside. Everything was very quiet, even more than the day before, as if the sound had been muffled. I went downstairs, turned on the coffee maker, and walked to the front door just to look outside, more out of habit than anything else. When I opened the curtain, the first thing I saw were the footprints. They came from the direction of the forest, starting several meters away from the cabin and following in an almost straight line to my door. They were boot prints, very well defined, as if they had been made recently since the snow was still soft around them. What made me stop and stare for a few seconds was the fact that there were no footprints going back. There was no trail leading away, no marks circling the house, nothing. It was just that path coming straight to the door and stopping there. At first I thought maybe someone had come up to the door and then left by stepping exactly on the same marks. But looking more closely, I could tell that wasn't the case. The prints were single, deep, with no overlap. I stood there for a few minutes trying to understand it logically before thinking of anything more unsettling. The first thing I did was look around the cabin through the window, trying to see if there were any other tracks on another side of the house, but from where I was, I couldn't see everything. So I grabbed my coat, put on my boots, and carefully opened the door, already feeling that cold air hitting my face, dry and sharp. The snow was still untouched across almost the entire property, except for those footprints that ended practically at the doorframe. I stepped outside and looked to the side, slowly walking around the house, feeling the snow sink under my feet, making that muted sound. There was nothing else. No other marks. No sign that anyone had walked around or approached the windows. I went back to the front and crouched down to observe the footprints more closely. They were a size that seemed to belong to an adult man, judging by the shape and depth, as if the person were relatively heavy. That started to give me a strange feeling in my stomach because it didn't make sense for someone to come all the way there and simply disappear. I went back inside quickly, more out of reflex from the cold than fear at that moment, and locked the door, even without knowing exactly why. I spent some time walking around the cabin, trying to calm down and think of a simple explanation. Maybe the property owner had stopped by early, or someone from maintenance, but I hadn't been informed of anything, and it also didn't make sense for someone not to leave any kind of notice or knock on the door. I decided to check the entire house, even though I already had the impression that everything was normal. I went upstairs to the bedroom, looked inside the bathroom, opened the closet, even pulled back the shower curtain as if someone could be hiding there, which now seems a bit exaggerated, but at the time felt necessary. Nothing was out of place. My laptop was where I had left it, my suitcase was closed, no window was open or unlocked. Even so, the feeling that something was wrong didn't go away. It was like I was ignoring something obvious, but I couldn't identify what. I tried to go back to work despite having that on my mind. I opened my laptop, started answering some emails, but I kept catching myself looking at the door, as if expecting someone to knock at any moment. The silence outside started to bother me in a different way. Before it had felt peaceful, now it felt too empty, almost artificial. At times I thought I heard something outside, like a faint dragging sound or a closer crack, but when I stopped to really listen, there was nothing. Around 10 a.m. I made more coffee and worked up the courage to look out the window again. The footprints were still there, intact, unchanged. That made me more uncomfortable, because it meant no one had come back to complete that trail. I even considered taking the car and going into town just to clear my head, but at the same time it felt like too much over something like footprints in the snow. I kept convincing myself that it was just someone who had passed by early, and that I was overreacting because I was alone. It was close to noon when the second thing happened. I was in the kitchen heating something quick to eat, when I impulsively looked out the side window of the cabin, which faced a smaller section of the front. That's when I saw that there were more footprints. Different from the first ones, not in shape but in position. They also came from the direction of the forest, but they started closer to the house this time, as if the person had appeared nearer. And again, they went straight to the door, stopping exactly at the same spot as before. A cold sensation ran through my body that had nothing to do with the temperature. I immediately dropped what I was doing and went to the door, but I didn't open it. I just stood there looking through the narrow glass beside it, trying to see something outside. There was no one, no movement. Just those two trails now, one slightly older and the other clearly recent, both ending in the same place. That was when it really sank in that this wasn't something that had just happened in the morning and was over. Someone had come there again, while I was inside the house. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at those two trails converging at almost the same point, trying to decide what to do. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but it didn't even make sense to call the police and say there were footprints in the snow. Even so, I started to feel a real need to get out of there. I went to the table, grabbed my car keys, and put them in my coat pocket just in case. Before doing anything, I decided to check the house again, this time much more carefully. I went to every window, checked the corners, and rechecked the locks. When I reached the back door, which led to a small wooden deck, I froze for a second. The snow there was also untouched, with no footprints at all, which meant that whoever had come had not circled the house, always straight to the front door. For some reason, that made me even more nervous, as if there was a specific intention there that I didn't understand. I went back to the living room and tried to calm down, but my body wouldn't follow. My heart was racing even though I was standing still. I decided I would leave for a few hours, go into town, sit in a cafe or something just to clear my head. I put on my boots, my coat, grabbed my bag, and walked to the front door. Before opening it, I paused with my hand on the doorknob and just listened. I don't know exactly what I expected to hear, but it felt important at that moment. The silence remained the same, so I unlocked it and slowly opened the door. The cold air rushed in again, but this time I noticed a faint metallic smell. Hard to explain, like when you open a metal door that's been sitting in the cold. I stepped outside and immediately looked to the left and right. Nothing. Just the snow, the trees, and the two trails of footprints ending there. I took a few more steps forward, feeling that growing discomfort, like I was being watched from somewhere in the forest, even though I couldn't see anything. I was just a few steps from the door when I looked once more at the end of the footprints almost automatically, and that's when I noticed a detail I hadn't seen before. Right where the footprints ended, the snow was slightly more compressed, as if the person had stood there for a while, not just arrived and left. It wasn't multiple prints, but more like a continuous pressure in the same spot, deeper than the rest. That gave me a very bad feeling, like someone had been standing there right in front of the door, maybe listening, maybe waiting. I took another hesitant step forward, and that's when I felt something strange under my foot, very faint, like there was a different layer beneath the snow. I looked down, and with the tip of my boot, pushed some of the snow aside in that deeper area. Under the snow there was wood, a section of the deck, but not outside it. It was exactly at the threshold of the door, as if the snow had been disturbed there several times and then covered again. And what unsettled me the most was realizing that it wasn't just that one deeper mark. There were small variations around it, almost imperceptible, as if someone had adjusted their footing several times, always in the same spot. At that moment, my instinct shifted completely. It no longer felt like someone who had passed by casually. It felt like someone who had come to my door, more than once, and stayed there. I immediately lifted my gaze toward the forest, trying to find any movement among the trees, any sign that someone was there now, watching me. I saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched grew much stronger, almost physical. That was when I decided I wasn't going to question whether I was overreacting anymore. I turned around almost instantly and went back inside the cabin, closing the door harder than I intended. I locked it, turned the small safety latch, and still stood there for a few seconds with my hand on the doorknob, as if that would stop something. My whole body was tense, and I realized my breathing was faster than normal. I grabbed my phone and this time seriously considered calling the police, but there was still that stupid doubt in my head that I didn't have any proof beyond footprints. Instead, I decided to call the cabin's owner. He answered after a few rings, sounding a bit distracted, like he was busy with something else. I quickly explained about the footprints, trying to keep my tone calm, but I know my voice sounded off. He was silent for a few seconds and then said he hadn't sent anyone there, that there was no maintenance scheduled, and that at that time of year, almost no one passed through that area. That was enough to remove any doubt I still had. While I was still on the phone with him, I started pacing around the living room, looking at the windows as if I expected to see someone at any moment. I asked if anyone else had access to the cabin, any spare key, anything like that. He said only he had an extra key and that he lived in another town more than an hour away. Then he mentioned something that made me go completely cold. He asked if I was sure the footprints only came from the forest, and stopped at the door, because according to him, the area behind the cabin led to an old trail that was no longer used, but could still be accessed by someone who knew the region well. I automatically turned my head toward the hallway leading to the back door, even though I knew I had already checked there. Just the idea that someone could be walking along that trail, getting that close to the house without being seen, made everything feel much more real and much closer. While I was still on the phone, something made a faint sound from the front of the house. It wasn't loud, nothing that broke the silence completely, but it was different from the usual creaks of wood or the wind. It felt closer, more controlled, like weight being carefully placed on something. I stopped moving immediately and stood still, trying to listen again. The man on the other end of the line asked if everything was okay, but I didn't answer right away. I took a few slow steps toward the front window, feeling that strange cold in my body, like I was about to confirm something I didn't want to. When I got close enough, I pulled the curtain just enough to look outside, and that's when I saw it. There was a third trail of footprints, fresher than the other two. The snow was still settling around the marks as if they had been made seconds earlier. They came from the same point in the forest and led to the door, stopping exactly in the same place. My stomach dropped instantly. I hadn't heard footsteps approaching. I hadn't seen anyone coming, but those footprints hadn't been there seconds before. I stared fixedly at that spot, trying to see anything, any movement, but there was nothing. No person, no shadow, no sign of someone leaving. It was as if someone had walked up to the door, while I was inside the house, and absolute silence meant simply stopped right outside. I slowly stepped back from the window without taking my eyes off the front of the house, with a very clear feeling that, at that exact moment, there was someone on the other side of the door. Story 2. My name is Daniel, I'm 38 years old, and I work with agricultural equipment maintenance. Last week I was driving through the interior of Montana, coming back from a service call at a very remote farm. It was late afternoon turning into night, and the snowstorm forecast had worsened faster than I expected. I still had about an hour and a half of road before reaching the nearest town, where I planned to spend the night before heading home the next day. The road was one of those very isolated ones, a single lane, no lighting, surrounded by open fields and some areas with denser trees. The snow started light, but in less than 20 minutes it had become much heavier, with the wind blowing the snow against the side of the car and significantly reducing visibility. I was driving slowly, hands firmly on the wheel, fully focused on the road because any mistake there could mean going off it. It was after a long curve that I saw the car. It was parked on the shoulder, slightly crooked, with half of it already covered by a layer of accumulated snow. At first I thought it was a car that had been abandoned for hours, maybe even since the previous day, because in storms like that it's common for someone to lose control and go off the road. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't as covered as it should be for something that had been there that long. The lights were off and I couldn't see anyone inside. I drove past it for a few meters, but it stuck in my mind. It was a very isolated stretch, and leaving someone there, if there was someone, could be truly dangerous in that cold. I ended up slowing down even more, checked the rearview mirror, and decided to carefully reverse until I was close to the car. I stopped a few meters behind it, turned on the hazard lights, and sat there for a few seconds, trying to decide if I really should get out of my car in that weather. I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, and opened the door. immediately feeling the freezing wind hit hard. The snow was already piling up quickly on the ground, and each step sank more than I expected. I walked slowly toward the car, also paying attention to my surroundings since visibility wasn't great. When I got close enough, the first thing that caught my attention was that the driver's window wasn't completely covered in ice from the inside, as usually happens when a car has been cold for a long time. I moved closer and touched the body of the car. It was still warm. Not hot like it had just been turned off, but definitely not cold as it should have been in that weather. That immediately put me on alert. I walked around to the driver's door and saw that it was slightly open, just a few centimeters, as if someone had left in a hurry or hadn't closed it properly. I pushed the door slowly, calling out something like, "Hello?" almost automatically expecting an answer that never came. The interior was empty. The driver's seat had a bit of snow accumulated near the open door, but not enough to suggest it had been there for long. There was no key in the ignition, no phone in sight, nothing particularly unusual except for the fact that there was simply no one there. I looked at the passenger seat, then the back seat, and everything seemed normal, just empty. I stepped away from the car and took a few steps around it, raising the flashlight to try to see better through the snow. There were no visible footprints leading away from the car, at least not in that immediate area. The wind was strong enough to cover tracks quickly, so I tried to convince myself that the person could have left a few minutes earlier and simply walked down the road or into the field. Even so, something about that scene felt wrong. A feeling hard to explain, like I had arrived too early to something that wasn't finished yet. I stood there for a few more seconds, trying to decide whether I should keep looking around or just go back to my car and continue my trip. The cold was already starting to bother me for real, even with my coat. The wind made that constant muffled sound and the snow hit my face sideways. I took a few more steps around the abandoned car, raising the flashlight and looking toward the road and also into the open field. There was nothing. No movement, no different sound besides the wind. That started to give me a strange feeling of exposure, as if I was too visible out there in the middle of nowhere. I decided it didn't make sense to stay outside any longer. If there was someone, I wasn't seeing them, and standing there wouldn't help. I walked quickly back to my car, glancing over my shoulder once or twice without even realizing I was doing it. When I reached my car door, I pulled the handle and got in quickly, closing it hard to block the wind. It was only after I closed the door that I noticed the first strange thing. The snow around my car wasn't the way I had left it. When I got out, I had made a clear path of footprints from the driver's door to the abandoned car. Now, besides those, there were other marks around my car. New footprints. They weren't mine. They were closer to the passenger side and also behind the car, as if someone had walked around it while I was at the other vehicle. I froze for a few seconds, staring at it through the window, trying to understand when that could have happened. I hadn't heard anyone approaching. I hadn't seen anyone pass by on the road. And even with the wind, those footprints were too well defined to have been there for long. I sat there inside the car without starting the engine yet, just staring at those new footprints as if somehow they might change or disappear. My first thought was that someone might be nearby and I simply hadn't seen them because of the snow. I quickly checked the mirrors, then turned my body to look directly through the rear window, trying to see better. Visibility was terrible, everything kind of white and moving because of the wind. Even so, I could still see the abandoned car a few meters behind, partially covered. There was no one visible around it. I looked back toward the passenger side and saw that some of the footprints stopped very close to the door, almost touching the car, as if someone had stood there for a few seconds. That made my stomach tighten immediately. I knew exactly where I had been in the last few minutes, and I knew those marks hadn't been there before. Without thinking much, I turned the key and started the engine. The sound felt too loud in that silence, which only increased my tension. My hands were slightly shaking as I put the car into gear. Before leaving, I glanced at the rearview mirror again, almost by reflex. And that's when I saw it. Near the abandoned car, right behind it, something started to move. At first, it looked like just snow being pushed by the wind, but within seconds, it became clear it wasn't that. A dark shape began to emerge from behind the car, slowly, like someone standing up from a crouched position or coming out from behind something. I couldn't see details of the face or body because of the snow, but I could make out the silhouette of a person. And what froze me for a moment was the fact that it wasn't coming from the road. It seemed to be coming from the side, from where there had been no visible trail before, as if it had been there the whole time, hidden, waiting. I didn't think about anything else after that. I just pressed the accelerator and started to leave as fast as the road allowed. The wheels slipped a bit because of the accumulated snow. The car slid slightly before straightening out, and for a second I thought I was going to lose control. But I managed to keep going. Even so, my reflex was to look in the rearview mirror again. The figure was now fully visible, standing behind the abandoned car. It wasn't running, not signaling, not trying to get my attention. It was just there, standing, looking in my direction. That was what unsettled me the most. Any reaction would have been easier to understand, someone asking for help, running, trying to approach. But not that. It was as if the person had been waiting for that exact moment when I decided to leave. I kept driving without stopping, maintaining the most stable speed I could despite the snowstorm. My heart was racing in a way I could feel in my chest and hands. For several minutes I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, even knowing I was already too far to see anything. The road remained empty. No other cars, no sign of movement. Only after about 20 minutes did I start to slow down a bit and try to organize my thoughts. I kept telling myself it must have been someone stuck in the snow, maybe trying to protect themselves from the wind, someone who had left the car and crouched behind it. But that didn't explain the footprints around my car. It didn't explain why I hadn't seen anyone before. And especially it didn't explain why that person had simply stood there watching me instead of asking for help. I didn't go back, not that day, not ever. And even now, what bothers me the most isn't having found that car. It's the feeling that if I had stayed outside for just a few more minutes, those footprints around my car wouldn't have been just around it. Story 3. My name is Eric, I'm 34 years old, and this happened to me and my girlfriend Lisa last winter. We live in Denver, and we had rented a winter house in the interior of Colorado to spend a quiet weekend, just the two of us, away from the city. I had been working a lot in the past few weeks, and the idea was simply to rest, cook something simple, and enjoy the silence. The house was very isolated on a dirt road that was already partially covered in snow when we arrived. It wasn't a small cabin, it was a larger house with a living room, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a central hallway. When we arrived, late in the afternoon, it was already snowing, but still lightly. We did the basics, turned on the heating, unpacked our things, checked doors and windows, mostly as a precaution, because the cold there was intense. I clearly remember closing all the living room windows, including a larger one that faced directly toward the front of the house. That night, the storm got much worse. The wind grew stronger, and you could hear it hitting the walls and windows in a constant, somewhat irregular way. Even so, everything was calm inside the house. We had dinner, watched something on TV, and went to bed around midnight. The heating was working well, and the bedroom was comfortable, nothing out of the ordinary. I must have slept for about 2 or 3 hours when I woke up with a strange feeling of cold. It wasn't that mild nighttime chill. It was like the temperature inside the room had suddenly dropped. At first, I thought the heater had stopped. Still half asleep, I reached out to feel the air and realized it was really too cold to be normal. That's when I heard the sound of the wind, but not muffled like before. It was more direct, louder, as if there were some opening in the house. I sat up in bed immediately, more awake now, trying to figure out where that stronger wind was coming from. Lisa woke up too, confused, asking if I had opened any window. I said no, already getting up. The floor was cold in a way that didn't make sense with the heating on. I opened the bedroom door, and as soon as I stepped into the hallway, I felt the cold air coming from the direction of the living room, even stronger. It was a direct, continuous cold, not the kind that seeps in through small cracks. The house was dark, with only a faint light coming from the kitchen, which we had left on. As I walked, the sound of the wind became clearer, coming in bursts. When I reached the end of the hallway and looked into the living room, I saw it immediately. One of the windows was open. It wasn't just unlocked. It was actually open, with a gap wide enough to let snow inside. The curtain was being pushed by the wind, lightly hitting the side, making a repetitive, dry sound. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring at it, trying to remember if at any point I had left that window open, even though I knew it didn't make sense. I clearly remembered closing everything. Lisa came up behind me, stopped as well, and stared. Her first reaction was to ask if someone could have come in. That gave me an immediate sense of discomfort. I slowly walked toward the window, feeling the cold intensify with every step. When I got closer, I saw that there was snow accumulated on the living room floor, right below the opening, spread in an irregular pattern, as if it had been carried in by the wind or by something else. The first thing I did was close the window right away, pulling it shut with force because the wind was pushing against it. The frame was freezing, almost hard to hold. As soon as I closed and locked it, the sound of the wind became more muffled, but the cold was still inside. That's when I looked more closely at the floor. That snow wasn't just scattered, it had marks. There weren't many, but you could clearly see that someone had stepped there. Footprints coming in through the window. I stood there staring at it for a few seconds, trying to understand if it could have been caused some other way, but it didn't make sense. The marks had the shape of boots, with a distinct sole pattern, and they led toward the hallway. Lisa came closer and saw them too. I felt her grip my arm tightly without saying anything. The footprints started from the window area and went straight into the house, crossing the living room and entering the hallway that led to the bedrooms. What made me more tense was that there were no signs of someone leaving. It was just a path coming in. I grabbed my phone immediately and turned on the flashlight, even though the kitchen light was still on. It felt necessary, as if the direct light would help me see better what was happening. I started following the footprints slowly, step by step, trying not to make noise, even without knowing exactly why. The sound of my own foot on the floor seemed too loud in that silence. Lisa stayed right behind me, very close. As we moved down the hallway, the footprints remained clearly visible, until suddenly they stopped. They simply ended in the middle of the hallway. It wasn't like they had faded or been covered. They stopped cleanly, as if the person had taken their last step there and disappeared. I stood there staring at that exact spot on the floor, trying to find any logical explanation. I even took a step forward, lighting up the rest of the hallway, expecting to see them continue somewhere, but there was nothing. No marks leading to the bedroom doors, no marks going back. Just that path from the window to that point, and nothing else. Lisa asked very quietly if someone could be hiding somewhere in the house. That immediately put my whole body on alert. I turned slowly and went to the first door in the hallway, which was the bathroom. I pushed it open carefully and turned on the light. Nothing. Everything normal. I opened the shower, looked behind the door, even inside the small cabinet. No one was there. I left and went to the second bedroom, which had been empty since we arrived. I did the same thing, opening it slowly, checking every corner, even under the bed. Nothing. Every space I checked and found empty didn't make me feel better. It only increased that feeling that something wasn't right. Because the marks were there. Someone had come in, and they hadn't left. When I went back to the hallway, Lisa was still standing there staring at the spot where the footprints ended, as if she was waiting for something to happen there. That's when I started to notice another detail that I hadn't paid attention to before. The cold wasn't just coming from the living room because of the open window. It was concentrated at that exact point in the hallway, right where the footprints ended. It was subtle, but you could clearly feel that the air there was colder than in the rest of the house. It didn't make sense because there was no window there, no visible draft. I slowly moved closer, extending my hand as if to feel the temperature of the air, and it really was colder. It wasn't in my head. Lisa noticed it too because she said she could feel a light breeze there, even with everything now closed. That made my mind start racing with possibilities I didn't want to consider. I took another step forward and looked directly at the bedroom doors as if trying to connect something. The door to our bedroom was slightly ajar, exactly as we had left it when we came out. But for some reason, that bothered me more than it should have. I couldn't remember if the position of the door was exactly the same. It may seem like a small detail, but in that moment, anything out of place felt important. I walked over, pushed the door slowly, and turned on the light. The room looked normal, the bed unmade, our things where we had left them. But the cold in there was also stronger than before. And that's when I heard a faint sound coming from inside the closet. I froze immediately. It wasn't a loud noise nor something obvious like someone moving around. It was more like a soft dragging sound, almost muffled, as if something had brushed against the inside of the wood. I stood there staring at the closet, trying to decide if I had really heard it or if it was just the wind putting pressure on the house structure. Lisa, right behind me, asked quietly what it was. I didn't answer right away, I just raised my hand for her to stay quiet. The room was silent except for the distant sound of the wind outside. I took a step forward, feeling the cold floor under my foot and that growing discomfort in my chest. My mind tried to come up with simple explanations like something falling inside the closet or the wood expanding, but none of them seemed to fit what I had heard. I got right up to the closet door and stood there for a few seconds just listening. Nothing, absolutely nothing. That almost made me open it immediately, just to get rid of the doubt. I grabbed the handle and slowly pulled. The door opened without resistance, making a slight creaking sound. I pointed my phone's light inside. Clothes hanging, our suitcase on the floor. Everything exactly as it had been before. No sign of anyone inside. I stepped in, moved some clothes aside, looked behind them, then crouched to check the bottom. Nothing. When I stepped back out, I felt a quick, almost automatic sense of relief, as if my body had been waiting for that confirmation. But it didn't last long, because as soon as I closed the closet door and turned back toward the room, Lisa was staring fixedly at the wall beside the bed, with an expression I had never seen on her face before. I followed her gaze immediately, trying to understand what she was seeing. At first, I didn't notice anything different. It was just the wall, a simple beige paint with a lamp mounted above the headboard. But then she pointed without saying anything, just extending her hand. That's when I saw it. Near the floor, right at the base of the wall, there was a dark stain that hadn't been there before. It wasn't large, but it stood out completely from the rest. I slowly moved closer and lit it with my phone. It didn't look like ordinary dirt. It was like moisture mixed with something darker, almost like a contact mark. And what disturbed me most was the shape. It wasn't spread out, it was concentrated, as if something had been pressed there for a while. I crouched down to look closer, and that's when I noticed something else. Just above that stain, at the height of the mattress, the fabric on the side of the bed was slightly pressed in, as if someone had leaned against it from the outside. It wasn't obvious at first glance, but once you saw it, you couldn't ignore it. I ran my hand over it almost without thinking, and the fabric was cold. Colder than the rest of the room. At that moment, a very clear feeling came into my mind, hard to explain rationally, that someone had been in that room with us, and not very long ago. I stood up quickly, looking around as if I expected to see someone in some corner, even knowing I had already checked everything. Lisa took a step back, almost pressing against the door, clearly more frightened now. That was the point where I stopped trying to understand and started thinking only about leaving. I looked at Lisa and said directly that we were leaving. She didn't question it, she just agreed immediately. We quickly went back through the hallway, passing again by the spot where the footprints ended. I glanced down as I passed, almost without thinking, as if expecting to see something different, but it was the same. We grabbed the keys, our phones, the basics, without even thinking about packing anything. The cold inside the house was still strange, concentrated in certain spots, and that only increased the feeling that something didn't make sense there. Before leaving, I took one last look at the living room. The snow on the floor was still there, the footprints starting at the window. Everything exactly as before. Nothing had changed, and somehow that was worse. I opened the front door and the cold wind hit hard again, almost like a shock after being inside the house. The snow was still falling heavily, quickly accumulating on the ground. We went straight to the car, barely speaking, just wanting to get in and leave. When I started the engine, my hands were still slightly shaking. I reversed slowly, being careful with the snow, and aligned the car on the road. Before accelerating, I looked in the rearview mirror, almost out of habit, and that's when I saw the living room window. It was open again, the curtain moving with the wind exactly like before. I know I had closed it, I remember closing it. I didn't say anything at the time, just put the car in gear and drove away. We never went back to get anything we left behind. And even today, what bothers me the most isn't the fact that someone entered that house. It's not knowing where that person was while we were inside. Story 4. My name is Tyler. I'm 41 years old and I work transporting equipment between small towns in the interior of Alaska. I spend a good part of my time driving alone, especially in the winter because many people avoid these routes when the weather gets worse. This happened at the end of February, during a nighttime trip between two small towns on a stretch of road that has practically no lighting or cell signal. I already knew that route, but that night the visibility was worse than usual because of the constant snow and crosswinds. It wasn't a heavy storm, but it was enough to make everything look kind of white and without contrast. I was driving slowly, keeping my full focus on the road with the heater on full and the radio low just to avoid complete silence. After almost an hour of driving without seeing another car, I became more alert because that kind of road at night can hide anything: thicker ice, animals, or even someone stopped. It was on a long straight stretch that I saw the figure for the first time. At first it looked like just a shape in the middle of the road, slightly distorted by the snow and the headlights. I automatically slowed down, trying to understand what it was. As I got closer, it became clear that it was a person, a man. He was walking very slowly in the middle of the lane with his back to me. What caught my attention immediately was how he was dressed, or rather, how unprepared he was. He wasn't wearing proper clothing for that cold. It looked like he had a jacket that was far too light without enough protection, and he was walking in the middle of the road as if he didn't feel anything. I slowed down even more until I was almost stopped a few meters behind him. The first thing that came to mind was that he might be lost or having some problem, maybe coming from a car that had been left behind on the road. I gave a light tap on the horn, nothing aggressive, just to get his attention. He didn't react. He kept walking at the same pace, short, steady steps, as if he hadn't heard me at all. That already started to make me uncomfortable. Normally, anyone in that situation would react immediately, at least turn to look at the car. I lowered the window a bit, feeling the cold air rush in instantly, and called out something like, "Hey, you okay?" Loudly. No response, no change in movement. I decided to pull over completely. I stopped a few meters behind him and left the engine running. I watched him for a few seconds, waiting for some kind of reaction. Then he stopped walking. He didn't turn his whole body at once, it was slow. First his head, then the rest, until he was facing me. The headlights partially illuminated his face, but the snow and the distance didn't allow me to see details clearly. Even so, there was something wrong in the way he looked at me. He didn't look confused or desperate or relieved to see someone. It was too neutral, almost empty. He took a few slow steps toward the car until he was just a few meters in front of it. Then he raised his arm and pointed directly at the back seat of my car. At first, I didn't understand. I automatically looked in the rearview mirror just by reflex, as if I expected to see someone already sitting there. There was no one. The back seat was empty, exactly as I had left it. I looked back at him, expecting that maybe he would say something, explain what he wanted, but he didn't say anything. He just kept pointing, arm extended steady without shaking, as if that was the only thing that mattered at that moment. That started to give me a very clear bad feeling. The kind you can't quite justify, but that puts your whole body on alert. I still thought about getting out of the car, asking more clearly, seeing if he really needed help. But there was something too wrong about it. The way he was standing, the lack of a normal reaction, the fact that he was walking on that road in that cold without proper clothing, none of it made sense. I let go of the steering wheel for a second, ran a hand over my face, trying to quickly decide what to do. Then I said through the window, more firmly this time, something like, "I can call someone for you, but I'm not opening the door." He didn't respond, he didn't lower his arm. He just stood there, pointing at the back seat. That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to take the risk. I rolled the window back up and put the car into gear. I started moving slowly, passing by him carefully, keeping my eyes fixed on the road. Even so, I couldn't avoid glancing to the side when the car was parallel to him. He didn't move out of the way, he just stood there, slightly turning his head to follow the car as I passed. There was no reaction of surprise, no irritation, nothing. Just that empty look following the movement. As soon as I passed him, I accelerated a bit more, wanting to create distance as quickly as possible. My heart was already racing, but I still tried to convince myself that it was just someone in shock or disoriented by the cold. But that didn't explain the gesture, nor his behavior. After a few seconds, almost by reflex, I looked in the rearview mirror. At first, I saw nothing but snow being kicked up by the tires. Then, as the distance increased a bit, I could see the road behind, and he was there, in the middle of the road, walking, in the same direction as me. I frowned immediately, trying to understand. Given the distance I had already created, he should have looked much smaller, farther away. But that wasn't what was happening. He seemed to be in almost the same position relative to the car, as if the distance between us wasn't increasing the way it should. That made me grip the steering wheel tighter, feeling a growing discomfort. I increased the speed a little more within what was safe for that road, trying to gain distance once and for all. The snow was still affecting visibility, and I didn't want to lose control, but at the same time I needed to get out of there. I looked again in the rearview mirror, this time more carefully, trying to figure out if it was just my impression. But it wasn't. He was still there in the middle of the road walking. And the strangest part was that his pace didn't seem to change. He didn't seem to run or speed up. It was the same slow step as before. Yet somehow he wasn't falling behind. That started to mess with my head in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. I tried to rationalize it, thinking it could be the visibility, the snow, the lack of reference points on the road. But it didn't make sense. I know that kind of road well. I know how distances behave there. And that wasn't right. I looked again, and this time I kept watching longer in the mirror. He was exactly in the same relative position, as if he were fixed there behind the car. And then I noticed something else. He was still looking in my direction. Even from a distance, you could tell by the alignment of his body, the way his head was facing forward, fixed. That's when I started to feel a strange pressure in my chest, like something was wrong in a deeper way than I could explain. I took my eyes off the mirror and focused only on the road for a few seconds, trying to calm down and keep control of the car. My hands were tighter on the wheel, and I realized I had been holding my breath without noticing. After a few seconds, I looked again. He was still there in the same position. At that point, it no longer seemed like an issue of distance or perspective. It was as if, regardless of speed, he remained exactly in the same spot behind me. I started thinking about accelerating more, but at the same time I knew it was too dangerous on that road. Any mistake could send me off it. So I kept a steady speed, trying to get out of that situation as safely as possible. After a few minutes, which felt much longer than they really were, I decided to test something. I took my foot off the accelerator for a few seconds, slowing down slightly. I looked in the mirror again. He remained exactly where he was, neither closer nor farther. That was what truly made me realize that this wasn't following any normal logic. I kept driving, trying not to panic, but it was already clear that this wasn't just going to stop. After a few more minutes, an idea came to me almost automatically. I turned off the radio completely, wanting to eliminate any distraction, and sat in total silence inside the car. That's when I started paying attention to another detail. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but then it became clearer. I could hear a sound, very faint, coming from behind. It wasn't loud, nor constant. It was like a muffled, irregular noise that appeared between the sound of the engine and the wind. Something that shouldn't have been there. My whole body tensed immediately. I didn't turn my head right away. I just stayed there, looking forward, trying to listen more carefully. The sound came again. A light dragging, almost like fabric or something brushing against a surface. My mind immediately went to the back seat. I felt a chill run up the back of my neck that had nothing to do with the temperature inside the car. Slowly, without making any sudden movements, I lifted my gaze to the interior rearview mirror, and for a second I didn't understand what I was seeing, because the back seat was no longer empty. There was something there, not occupying the entire seat, not clearly like someone sitting normally. It was more like a low, dark shape, as if someone were leaning forward near the seat back, out of the direct angle of the mirror. I couldn't see a face or hands or anything defined, just that presence there in the back where there had been no one before. My first instinct was to turn my head, but something stopped me. I felt that if I looked directly, it would become too real, so I stayed still, looking only through the mirror, trying to understand what I was seeing without truly facing it. The sound came again, clearer this time. A slight shift, like someone adjusting their weight on the seat. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I felt my whole body tense, as if I were waiting for something to happen at any second. My breathing became short, controlled, almost automatic. I didn't know how that could have happened. I hadn't stopped the car, I hadn't opened any door, and yet there was something back there. And the worst part was when, very slowly, that shape seemed to rise a little higher, as if approaching the line of the mirror. I couldn't take it anymore. Without taking my eyes off the road, I reached up and turned on the interior light of the car all at once. The reflection in the mirror changed completely, and for a second I thought I would clearly see someone there. But there was no one. The back seat was empty, clean, exactly as it should have been. I felt an immediate, almost physical relief, as if something had been lifted off my chest. But it didn't last, because at the exact moment the light came on, the sound stopped completely, total silence, and that didn't feel like a good sign. I stayed like that for a few seconds with the light on, staring fixedly at the mirror, trying to understand if I had imagined everything. But I knew I hadn't. I knew what I had seen and especially what I had heard. After a few seconds, I gathered the courage to look in the external rearview mirror again. The road behind was empty. There was no one walking in the middle of the road anymore. No figure, no movement. It was as if he had never been there. Even so, I didn't turn off the interior light until I reached the next town. And to this day, what bothers me the most isn't the man on the road. It's the feeling that for a few minutes I wasn't alone inside the car. Story 5. My name is Kevin, I'm 29 years old, and this happened to me and a friend of mine, Josh, the winter before last. We had decided to go hiking in a more isolated area in the interior of Idaho, something we had done before, but never at that time of year with so much snow. The idea was to spend the day walking, take some photos, and head back before it got dark. But the weather turned much faster than the forecast had indicated. Early in the morning it was calm, normal cold, cloudy sky. But near mid-afternoon, it started snowing harder, and the wind picked up enough to begin covering parts of the trail. We still tried to continue using the GPS on the phone, but the signal started failing and visibility dropped significantly. In a short time, it became clear that we were no longer exactly on the original path. We kept walking for a while, trying to find a familiar point or even retrace our steps, but the snow had already covered a lot. The cold started to hit hard, the kind that goes through your clothes and straight into your body. That's when Josh pointed ahead, somewhat relieved. Through the trees we could see a light. At first it seemed distant, but as we got closer it became clear that it was a cabin. Small, simple, with a light on inside. At that moment it felt like the best thing possible. We quickened our pace, already tired and stiff from the cold. When we got closer we saw there was no car nearby, no visible trail leading to it other than the one we were making in the snow. Even so, the light was there, steady, as if someone was inside. We reached the door almost without thinking, more focused on getting out of the cold than anything else. Josh was the first to try the handle, probably expecting it to be locked. But it wasn't. The door opened easily, making a slight creaking sound. As soon as we stepped inside, the difference in temperature was immediate. It wasn't warm like a comfortable house, but it was much less cold than outside. The first thing I noticed was the fireplace lit. There was real fire there, with wood burning, crackling softly. That meant someone had been there recently. The light came from a simple ceiling bulb, slightly yellowish, giving the place a strange look. We closed the door behind us and stood there for a few seconds, just trying to warm up and catch our breath. The cabin was small, basically a single room with a table, 2 chairs, an old sofa, and a small kitchen in the corner. What made me uncomfortable quickly was realizing that there was food on the table. It wasn't anything elaborate, but it looked recent. A plate with leftovers of something that looked like soup, a mug with some liquid still inside. There was no dust, no signs of abandonment. This wasn't a forgotten cabin. It was used. And judging by the state of things, it had been used very recently. I looked at Josh and he seemed to be thinking the same thing I was. We had entered someone's place now without knowing where that person was. We stood there in silence for a few seconds, just looking around, as if expecting someone to appear from somewhere in the cabin and explain the situation. I even called out a hello, a bit loudly, more out of courtesy than expecting an answer. Nothing. No sound other than the fire crackling in the fireplace. Josh took a few steps around the cabin, checking the corners while I stayed closer to the door. There was no separate bedroom, just a small space with a bed against the wall. The blankets were messy, as if someone had gotten up recently. That gave me a strange feeling of intrusion, like we were there too early. I started thinking that maybe the owner was outside, cutting wood or doing something else, and would come back at any moment. That's when we heard the first sound from outside. Footsteps in the snow, not very fast, not very heavy, but clear enough not to be just the wind. We looked at each other immediately without saying anything. The sound came again, closer this time. Someone was walking outside the cabin. My whole body went on alert instantly. It didn't sound like someone running or in a hurry. It was a steady, calm rhythm, as if the person was walking around the house, Josh turned off the light immediately, almost by reflex. The cabin became darker, lit only by the fireplace. We didn't say anything, but we both understood that it was better not to draw attention. We slowly moved away from the center area and stayed closer to the sidewall, trying not to make any noise. The sound of footsteps continued, now more clearly circling the cabin. I could hear the snow being pressed with each step. That muffled, steady sound you instantly recognize when someone is walking on fresh snow. My breathing became shorter without me noticing, and I started paying attention to every detail, as if any wrong movement could give away that we were inside. Josh was beside me, practically motionless, looking toward the door. Neither of us said anything. After a few seconds that felt much longer, the footsteps stopped. They stopped exactly in front of the door. There was no more sound of movement, just the wind and the crackling of the fireplace. That was what made me the most tense, because it was as if the person had arrived there and simply stopped. I slowly looked toward the small window next to the door. There was a tiny gap in the curtain, just enough to see a bit outside. I moved closer very slowly, feeling my heart beating faster, and pulled just enough to look without being seen. Outside visibility was still poor because of the snow, but I could make out a silhouette. A person standing right in front of the door. They weren't knocking or trying to open it. They were just there, standing, facing the cabin. What unsettled me immediately was the posture. It didn't look like someone who had just arrived and was deciding what to do. It looked like someone who already knew exactly where they were and was waiting. I watched for a few seconds, trying to figure out if the person was looking at the door or the window. It was hard to tell for sure, but it felt like they were looking straight inside. I slowly moved away from the window and went back to Josh's side. I whispered what I had seen and he just nodded without asking anything. The silence inside became heavy in a strange way, as if the space had gotten smaller. We waited for some movement outside, a knock on the door, someone calling, anything, but nothing happened. Time passed in a way that was too slow, hard to measure. And then, after a few seconds that felt like minutes, the footsteps started again. But this time they weren't moving away from the cabin. They were moving toward the side, as if the person was starting to walk around it. I felt my stomach tighten immediately, because that removed any doubt that the person was just passing by. They were circling the cabin, and doing it calmly without hurry, as if they had time. We stayed completely still, following the sound of the footsteps moving from one side to the other, disappearing for a few seconds and then reappearing in another part of the wall. At times it sounded closer to the window, at others farther away, but always steady. There was no hesitation. It was a continuous, controlled movement. That started to give me a very clear feeling that the person knew exactly what they were doing. After a while, the footsteps stopped again, this time somewhere behind the cabin where we didn't have a direct view. I looked at Josh and it was clear he was thinking the same thing as me. If that person decided to try to get in, we didn't have much we could do inside there. The door didn't look very strong, and the windows were simple. The fireplace continued crackling softly, lighting the room with that unstable glow. And then, in the middle of that silence, we heard a faint sound coming from the door itself. It wasn't a knock. It was more like a touch. Slow. Almost like someone testing the handle without making noise. We froze immediately. The sound didn't repeat right away, but it was enough to make it clear that the person was there on the other side, testing the door. I felt my whole body tense, as if waiting for the next move. Josh took a very slight step back, almost imperceptible, as if he wanted to move out of the direct line of the door. I stayed still, staring, trying to hear any other sound. After a few seconds, it came again. A slight movement on the handle, very controlled, without force, as if the person wasn't trying to break in, just to confirm something. And that's when something made my stomach drop completely. The door wasn't locked. We had closed it when we came in, but we hadn't locked it. I looked at Josh immediately, and it was clear he had realized the same thing. The problem was that even so, the person outside didn't open it. That was what made me the most uncomfortable, because it meant they weren't trying to force their way in. They were waiting, as if they were sure that at some point the door would be opened from the inside. That thought stayed stuck in my head as we remained there in absolute silence, not knowing how much longer it would last. After a few seconds that felt much longer than they really were, the sound on the handle stopped completely. No footsteps, no movement, just the wind outside and the low sound of the fire. That was worse than anything before, because while there had been sound, at least we could track where the person was. Now we couldn't. Now it felt like they were just standing there doing nothing, I felt a strange weight in the air, as if the presence was still there on the other side of the door, very close. Josh moved a little closer to me and very quietly asked if we should run into the forest through the back. I shook my head immediately. Going out into that snow without direction with someone out there felt worse. We stayed silent for a few more minutes, trying to decide what to do, when we finally heard the footsteps again. But this time they were moving away, slow at the same pace as before, going farther from the cabin. I didn't move right away. I waited until the sound disappeared completely. Only then did I go to the window very slowly and pulled the curtain just enough to look. There was no one visible, just the snow falling and a trail of footprints around the cabin, forming a complete circle. That was already strange on its own. But what really made me step back was realizing that there was no trail coming from the forest to the cabin, only marks around it, as if the person had appeared there and just kept walking around. We didn't stay any longer. We waited a few minutes, grabbed our things, and left in the opposite direction, without looking back. And to this day, what bothers me the most isn't not knowing who that person was. It's not understanding where they came from. Story 6. My name is Aaron. I'm 45 years old, and I've been living alone in a house in the countryside of Minnesota for a little over 3 years. I work remotely with technical support, so I'm able to live quite far from town without needing to go there often. I've always liked this kind of routine, silence, few people, just me and the basics of everyday life. My house is in a very isolated area, with a dirt road that leads to the nearest highway, about a 15-minute drive. In the winter, everything gets even quieter. The snow completely covers the ground, and any movement around becomes very easy to notice. I was already used to that kind of constant silence that can even feel uncomfortable to someone who isn't familiar with it. That week it had snowed heavily during the night. I remember waking up early as usual, making coffee and going to the kitchen window to look outside, more out of habit than anything else. That's when I noticed the footprints. At first, I didn't quite understand what I was seeing. It looked like a strange pattern in the snow, something that wasn't just a straight path. When I looked more closely, I felt an immediate discomfort. The footprints were circling the house, not just once, multiple times. A continuous trail forming circles all around the house, very close to the structure, as if someone had been walking there repeatedly throughout the entire night. I stood there for a few seconds, just staring, trying to understand it logically before thinking of anything else. I grabbed my coat and went out the front door to take a closer look. The cold was intense, that dry air that makes your face burn immediately. The snow was still soft, with no sign of strong wind overnight, which made the footprints very well defined. When I started walking around the house, it became even clearer. It wasn't a random path. The footprints formed complete loops, very close to the wall, as if the person had been following the outline of the house with precision. And it wasn't just one or two loops. There were several, overlapping in some areas, but still visible as a repeated pattern. What bothered me the most was when I tried to find the beginning or the end of that trail. I walked a bit farther away from the house, looking at the surrounding snow, expecting to see where the person had come from. But there was nothing. No trail coming from the road, no footprints leading toward the forest, just that circle around the house. It was as if the person had appeared there, started walking, and then disappeared the same way. I stayed there for a few minutes, walking slowly, analyzing every detail, trying to find a simple explanation. I thought about someone playing around, someone from the area passing by for some reason. But it didn't make sense. No one passes through that area without reason, much less walks around a house several times in the middle of the night. I went back inside, trying to convince myself that there was some simple explanation I wasn't seeing. I closed the door, locked it as usual, and stood in the middle of the living room for a few seconds, just listening to the silence. That house had always been quiet, but at that moment it felt different. I looked out the windows from time to time, expecting to see some movement outside, but there was nothing. The trail was still there, intact, as if constantly reminding me that someone had been there during the night. I tried to go back to my routine, open the computer, respond to some work things, but my attention didn't stay on anything for long. Throughout the rest of the day, I went outside a few times to check again, always hoping to find some new detail, some track leading to the road or to the forest. Nothing. The pattern remained the same. As the snow lightly accumulated throughout the day, Some parts started to become less defined, but you could still clearly see the circular pattern around the house. The sun barely appeared and the sky stayed that constant gray, making everything look flat. By late afternoon, it was clear I wouldn't find any explanation that day, and that's when a concern started to feel more real. If it had happened once, nothing was preventing it from happening again. When it started to get dark, I felt that kind of tension you try to ignore, but that stays there in the background all the time. I closed all the curtains, checked the locks on the doors and windows again, something I didn't usually do so carefully. I made something simple to eat, but I wasn't very hungry. The house felt smaller, more closed in, as if the silence was heavier than usual. At times, I found myself stopping in the middle of the room just to listen, trying to identify any sound different from the wind outside. Nothing. Just that constant silence that sometimes almost bothers your ears. I went to bed earlier than usual, more because I wanted the day to end quickly than out of tiredness. The bedroom was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the digital clock on the nightstand. It took me a while to fall asleep, but at some point I did. I don't know exactly how long later, but I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud or sudden, it was light, rhythmic. For a few seconds I stayed lying there, trying to understand what it was, and then it became clear. It was the sound of footsteps in the snow, outside, slowly circling the house. I stayed completely still in bed, trying to listen better without making any movement. The sound was low but clear enough not to be mistaken for the wind. It was that muffled noise of snow being pressed with regular intervals, like someone walking slowly. And it wasn't fixed in one spot. It moved. I could tell it was passing from one side of the house to the other, exactly like the trail I had seen earlier. That made my whole body go on alert immediately. My breathing became more controlled, almost automatic, as if I were trying not to make any noise. After a few seconds, I slowly sat up in bed without turning on the light. I stayed there in the dark, just listening. The footsteps continued, steady, circling the house. At times, they seemed closer to the bedroom wall, at others farther away, but always at the same rhythm. There was no hurry, no change in speed. This didn't feel like someone just passing by. It felt like someone repeating a path. I thought about getting up and going to the window, but something held me back. The idea of looking outside and seeing someone there, that close, didn't feel like something I was ready to face at that moment. I stayed there in the dark for a few more minutes, just listening to that sound making loop after loop around the house. At some point, I started to notice that the footsteps were getting closer to the bedroom wall. It wasn't a sudden change, but you could tell the sound was louder, more defined, as if the person was walking very close to the window. My instinct was to get out of bed and move away a bit, staying against the opposite wall still without turning on the light. I could hear each step more clearly now, the exact interval between them, the weight shifting from one foot to the other. It was too slow to be someone in a hurry. It felt deliberate. And then suddenly the footsteps stopped. Right outside my bedroom. I held my breath immediately, waiting for any other sound. Nothing. No movement, no dragging, no continuation of the path, just silence. That was worse than the footsteps, because now it felt like the person wasn't walking anymore. They were standing there on the other side of the wall. I stayed still for a few seconds, trying to decide what to do. And that's when I heard a different sound. A light touch on the wall. Not a knock. It was something slow, like someone placing their hand on the outside and lightly sliding it across the wood. I felt a chill run up my spine instantly. It wasn't just fear. It was that very clear sense of proximity, as if someone was just a few inches away from me, separated only by a wall. I stayed completely still, trying to listen for any other sound. The touch didn't repeat immediately, but you could feel that something had changed. The silence now felt heavier, more present. I slowly looked toward the bedroom window, which was covered by a thick curtain. I couldn't see anything outside, no light, no shadow. Even so, the feeling that someone was there remained. I took a few very slow steps toward the bedroom door, trying to move away from that wall. Every movement felt too loud, even though I was trying to be as quiet as possible. When I reached the hallway, I stopped and listened again. No footsteps, no sound of someone moving away, just the wind outside. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to understand if it was over, or if it had just changed position. The entire house felt quieter than ever, as if it were too empty. I stayed there in the hallway for a while, a time I can't really measure. It could have been seconds or minutes, but it felt much longer. The house was completely silent now, in a way that almost pressed against my ears. I thought about going back to the bedroom, but the idea of being near that wall again didn't feel right. So I stayed there, standing still, trying to hear anything that indicated the person had left. Nothing. No footsteps, no sound in the snow. That didn't feel normal, because before I could clearly hear when the person was walking around the house. Now it had simply stopped. After a while, I decided to gather some courage and go to the living room. I walked slowly, following the same path as always, trying to keep my breathing under control. When I got near the front window, I stood still for a few seconds before doing anything. Then I pulled the curtain just enough to look. Outside, the snow was still falling lightly, illuminated by the house's exterior light. And there were the footprints, new ones, well-defined, following exactly the same pattern as before, complete circles around the house. But this time there was something more. At one point, right in front of the window, the mark stopped for a moment deeper, as if the person had stood there, still, looking inside.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.